Hi there, I'm Trevor and welcome to TH Training Painting. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make some Fir Trays. These little trays are actually really easy to make. They're just made from some sponges and some pipe cleaners, and they're super easy to make, just like everything else in my Battlefield Basics range. The trays will not win any prizes for realism, but where they win is they are super easy to make and very inexpensive. So I'll grab my tools, get myself a cup of tea, and let's get to work. The tools and materials I'm going to be using are some sheet materials for the bases. I'll be using some 3mm hardboard, pipe cleaners, marker pen, hot glue gun, multi-purpose filler, PVA glue, some sponges, scissors, hairspray, sand and small stones, flock, and of course some paint and paint brushes. To start making my trays, I'm going to need some bases. I'm using some hardboard which has been cut into regular shapes like these. But you can use whatever sheet material you have available. It could be MDF, plywood, grey board, or even plastic sheets. This base here will hold one tray, this one will hold two, and this base will hold three. My bases are sized at about 50mm by 50mm for each tree being added to it. So the base holding 3 trays is roughly 150mm by 50mm wide. I'm going to be making some fir trees, and to make the trunk and roots of the tree, I'm going to use some pipe cleaners. Taking a pipe cleaner, I'll start by cutting it in half, then fold the 2 pieces in the middle. This end will be the top of the trunk that is attached into the sponge, and these ends will become the roots of my tree. I'll twist the top of the pipe cleaners together to create the tree trunk. Once I have about 20 or 30mm of pipe cleaner, I'll stop, as this is enough for the height of the trunk. Then I splay the remaining parts of the pipe cleaner to create the roots and also the basic shape of my trunk. But the roots are a little too long, so I could just cut them shorter, or I can twist the root pieces together to create more interesting shape. This bit here is still a bit too long, so I'll just fold it and twist it some more. And I'll do the same thing with these other root pieces, twist them together, and then arrange them into interesting shapes. Hopefully you can see what I was doing there when I was twisting the pipe cleaners to create my tree trunk. Now I'll make the piece lie flat and grab one of my bases, and I can arrange the roots to better fit onto the base. There it is. I'm happy with the shape of the tree trunk and the roots. So I'll make some more trunks and roots for my other bases using some more pipe cleaners. Before I glue the tree trunk to my base, I'm going to use my marker pen and draw around the roots I made. I don't have to do this, but it will help when gluing the tree trunk to the base, as it acts as a guide to help me know where to add the glue. So that's my rough outline done. As you can see, I've made all my tree trunks and also marked my bases. Now I'm ready to glue them onto the bases. I'll be using my hot glue gun for this. I have my old and knackered cutting mat down to protect my work surface, and when the glue is ready, I'll add some glue to the base using the marker lines I made as a guide. Now I press the tree trunk into the glue. Remember to take care and not burn your fingers when using a hot glue gun. That's the trunk attached to the base. Now I'll just glue the rest of these trunks onto their bases. That's all the tree trunks glued onto the bases, and I've also cleared away any strings of glue. But the trunks are not very sturdy at the moment, but I can try and fix this by adding some multi-purpose filler to them, which will strengthen them and also add some more texture. So in this container I have a 50-50 mix of filler and water. Then, grabbing a paintbrush, I'll just add the mix to the pipe cleaner, trunks and roots. I'll just paint it on. The mix is quite gloopy and messy, but this is absolutely fine. Remember to use an inexpensive paintbrush for this. Don't go using your best miniature painting brushes. Decent, inexpensive paintbrushes can be found in most discount stores. That's the first one done. I'll set it aside to dry and get on with adding the mixture to the others. That's the multi-purpose filler mix, now completely dry. and it has strengthened the trunk a bit, and it has also helped reduce the fuzzy texture of the pipe cleaners. The next thing I'm going to do is add some texture to the rest of the base. The easiest way to do this is to paint on some PVA glue and then add some stones and sand to the base. Grabbing my tub of PVA glue and a paintbrush, I'll start painting the glue onto the base, making sure I don't get any of the glue onto the tree trunk, whilst also trying to get the glue as close as I can to the roots. That's me done with adding the glue to the base. I'll grab my small container of stones. I'll set the model on the lid of my container, then grab a handful of the stones and scatter them onto the base. You can add each stone individually if you wish, but there's no real wrong way to do this. Tap the base to remove any excess stones. I'll just clear these stones away. Now grabbing my kiln dried sand, I'll do the same thing as I did with the stones and cover the base with it. Tap off the excess, and that's the base textured. Some sand has got into the grooves of the roots, but once the base is dry I can easily brush them away if needed. So I'll leave this to dry and get on with adding texture to the other bases. Here are the bases with all the texture added, and now it's dry. I could start painting them now, but I'm not going to do that just yet. What I am going to do is seal the bases and tree trunks with this sealant mixture, which is an equal parts mixture of multi-purpose filler, PVA glue and water, which I'll just paint onto the base using an inexpensive paintbrush. This sealant will help the stones and sand adhere to the base and increase their durability, so bits will not fall off when I'm using them in my games. I don't worry if any stones fall off the base while I'm adding the sealant. It just means they won't properly adhere to the base, and they better fall off now than when I'm painting, or even but worse when I'm using the model in my games. So that's the first base done. I'll leave it to dry and get on with adding the coating to the others. That's the construction of the bases completed, ready for painting. But before I do that, I want to make the foliage for the trees. And for that, I'm going to use a sponge. This is just a regular sponge I bought at my local discount store, and it's absolutely perfect for this project. For the foliage of my tree, I'll cut out a triangular shape from the sponge, then trim it down to become more cone shaped, and then that shape will be my foliage, which will eventually be affixed to the tree trunks I've already made. Before I start cutting my foam, I need to work out the height and width I wish my foliage to be. For 28mm scale gaming, I would suggest cutting the foam at a height of about 80mm and with a width of about 40 to 50mm. But one thing I do need to take into consideration when it comes to the width of my foliage is to measure the space between the trunks that I've glued to the bases. For example, this trunk is close to the other one, and hopefully as you can see here it's about 40mm apart. So I need to make sure that my foliage is no wider than 40mm. The sponges I have are roughly 80mm wide, so I'm going to use that as my height, and then with a marker pen I'll simply draw the triangle shape I wish to cut out. I'll mark the centre of the sponge on both edges, then make a mark 20mm away from the centre mark on the left and the right of it. This will make my 40mm width of my foliage. Now I'll draw two lines to the centre mark on the opposite edge, which will make my triangle. Then I make a mark 40mm from the tip of the triangle and draw a line to the mark on the opposite edge to create another triangle. Then do the same thing on the other side to create my third triangle in this sponge. I should also let you know that the sponges I'm using are about 40mm thick, which is absolutely perfect for me. But depending on the sponges you can find, you may have to trim the thickness of your sponge to suit your model. That's the sponge marked. Now I can do the same thing with the other one. With all the sponges marked out, I'll grab a pair of scissors and cut the triangles. That's the sponge shapes cut. These will use to create the foliage of my tree, like this. But I need to make them a bit more cone shaped. And the easiest way to do that is to grab a pair of scissors and just cut the foam. I'm just trimming bits off the sponge to create my cone shape. Remember, narrow at the top, wider at the bottom. I also want to remove some of the straight edges and the obviously flat areas of the sponge, so I'm trying to create a more natural looking shape. Remember, take care when using sharp tools. I'm also plucking some bits out of the sponge, which will help break up any lines and hopefully make it look better. I'll continue cutting these sponges to create my foliage. Quick tip, when making the hole in the base of the foliage, I find it useful to use your scissors like some tweezers to pluck out the sponge at the bottom and hopefully create a channel to which the trunk can be inserted. Hopefully you can see the hole that I've made here. And then I can pull the sponge onto the trunk like this. I'll just do this with the rest of the sponges. I have some gloves on because the next stage is very messy. Here's the tray at the moment and mine is looking very white, although yours may look different depending on the colour of sponge you're using. I could try painting the sponge, but I have an easier way, and that is to give the sponge a bath in some green paint. For this, I'm going to use some sap green acrylic paint, which I'll soak the sponges in. However, before I start, I have one quick tip for you, and it's this block of polystyrene with some wooden skewers in it. This is my drying block, and it can be used to help the sponges dry once they're coated in the paint. I just stick the sponge into the skewer like this, and this will stop it from sticking to anything as it dries. And remember to put down some paper to protect your work surface. To begin, I've created this bath of green paint using a takeaway food container. I've thinned the paint down with some water. As you can see, I've made the paint very thin, but this is just fine for what I want to do. And this is why I'm wearing gloves, as I will just dunk the sponge into the paint and let it absorb the paint, making sure to cover it all. Wring the sponge out and add it to my drying block. Now, I'll just repeat this process for all my other sponges. That's all the sponges soaked in green paint. I'll just leave them to dry. While the sponges are drying, it's now a great time to paint the trunks and bases. I find it easier to paint them now before I add the foliage to the trunks. The first part I'm going to paint is the trunks and the roots, and for that I'm going to give them a base coat of some raw umber acrylic paint. With some paint in my palette, which I thinned down with some water, I'll grab myself a paintbrush and start adding my base coat. With the trunks and roots base coated, and I can add a base coat of paint to the stones, and for that I'm going to use some neutral grey acrylic paint. I've got some paint ready to go, so I'll start painting the stones, making sure not to get any of the paint onto the trunks and roots that I've already painted. Here we go, all the stones have been painted. Time to give the rest of the base a base coat of brown paint, and the colour I'm going to be using is some burnt umber acrylic paint. As before, I have some watered down paint in my palette ready to go, and I'll start painting onto the base. Don't worry if I get any brown onto the stones, as this will actually add some dirt and weathering to them. That's all the base coats completed. I'll just leave them to dry. Time to dry brush the bases. The first area to get dry brushed will be the trunks and roots. And the colours I'll be using are, firstly, this light brown called Country Maple, and then I'll use some buff titanium as my highlight. If you've never done any dry brushing before, you can see my tutorial on it right here. Using a flat paintbrush, I'll start painting the roots and the trunks. That's the first colour completed. Now I'm going to lightly dry brush on some of the buff titanium. With the trunks and roots completed, I'm now going to dry brush the stones. For that, I'm going to use these two lighter shades of grey acrylic paint. With the paint in my palette, I'll grab a flat dry brush and start painting on the darker shade of grey. I'm not worried if I get any of the grey paint onto the base, as I can fix that later on, although I am being careful not to get any of the paint onto the trunk and roots. That's those all done. I'll continue on with these bases. Grabbing a smaller flat paintbrush, I'm going to lightly dry brush the stones with the lighter shade of grey just to highlight their edges. There we go, all the stones are painted. Time to paint the rest of the base, and for that I'm going to dry brush on some yellow ochre acrylic paint, followed by a light dry brush of buff titanium. Again, with the paint in my palette, I'll get myself a flat paintbrush and start dry brushing the rest of the base, taking care not to get paint onto the areas I've already painted. That's the first colour all done. Now I'll do these other two. Grabbing a smaller paintbrush, I'm going to lightly dry brush the base with the buff titanium just to give the base some highlights. And that's all the bases painted. Now my sponge foliage is completely dry and ready to be attached to my tree trunk. And the easiest way to do this is by using some PVA glue. So, grabbing my tub of glue and a paintbrush, I'll take one of my bases, paint some of the glue around the top of the trunk like this. Then, taking one of my sponges, I'll insert the trunk into the hole I made, and that's the sponge attached. It looks okay now, but there's another stage that'll make the foliage look even better. I'll just give the glue some time to dry and continue working on these other trees. That's the glue dry, and the next stage is to make the foliage look a lot better. And I'll do this by gluing some coarse flock onto the sponge to create the look of some leaves. I'm going to use this dark green coarse flock, as I'm making fir trees which usually are a darker shade of green. I'm using some PVA glue to attach the flock to the sponges. This tub of PVA glue has been thinned down with some water at a ratio of about 50-50, so half water, half PVA glue. With a paintbrush, I'll just add the glue to the sponge. That's the sponge coated in glue. With my container of coarse flock, I'll start adding the flock onto the sponge by sprinkling it onto the area where I've added the glue. I'm making sure to get the flock all over this sponge. That's the flock added. If there are any areas where the flock is not adhered, I'll just wait until the glue is completely dry before adding a little more glue to that area and then sprinkling some more flock on it. I'll just continue working on the other trees using the same technique of the watered down PVA glue and coarse flock. That's the glue and the flock now dry, and I added a second layer of coarse flock to my sponge foliage. I want to seal the foliage so it doesn't come off during use. And the easiest way to do that is with some hairspray. Yes, hairspray. I'm using a matte hairspray for a strong hold. I'll give the foliage a light spray of the hairspray. I recommend giving the model several light coats of hairspray instead of one heavy coating. I'll just get on with sealing the rest of these trees. And remember to spray in a well ventilated area. That's my fir trees almost completed. I could start using them now, but I want to add some flock on the bases to represent grass. And for that, I'm going to use some of my mid-green fine turf flock. With the flock in the container, I'll grab my PVA glue and a paintbrush, then paint the glue onto the base in the areas where I want the flock to stick to. When making your own trees, you can decide how much glue you want to add to your base, depending on how much or how little the flock you want to add. So you can have the base completely covered in grass or have it very patchy with just a few clumps here and there. It's entirely up to you. That's the glue added. So I'll sprinkle the flock onto the areas where I added the glue. Once all the glue has been covered, I can tap off the excess into the container. And there you go, that's the base now flocked. That's them all done, I'll just leave them to dry. Here are my completed fir trees. They are looking great and will look even better on the tabletop. I really hope you enjoyed this video and have learned how to make your own inexpensive fir trees for your tabletop games. It'd be great if you give this video a like or share, and remember to subscribe if you want to see more of my content. Also, check out my website at thtrain.com where you can see more of my work. And you can contact me in the comment section below or through my social media links in the description. Thanks for watching.